Good luck, everyone.
Yeah, good luck, everyone.
Let's have a good session. Let's have a little fun with it too, huh?
Yeah. No, that's what I think. Let's, not a stodgy presentation. Let's just have a good conversation. And I think we're very happy to host this as well. It's important. There hasn't been too many company voices part of this discussion from smaller European companies yet. Okay. Perfect. Hello, everybody. My name is Astrid Nummelin Karlberg, and I'm Open Forum Europe's Policy Director, and I will be your moderator for today's event on the Digital Markets Act and its potential impact on digital SMEs. Open Forum Europe, for those of you who don't know, is a Brussels-based think tank working on the intersection of open technologies and public policy. We'll go by OFE for short. But before we get going, I'll just some super quick things or points on some housekeeping. We want our events to be a space for an open exchange, but we only have 60 minutes. So we'll see how much time we'll actually end up having for the Q&A. That being said, if you want to ask a question, please write it in the chat on Element, and our team and I will keep an eye on it and try our best to weave them into the conversation. The event will be recorded and live streamed, just so you know. And like all our activities, this exchange is covered by the OFE community participation guidelines. You can find those on our website. We also sent them out. But regarding this, it's not something particularly tricky. Just be your most friendly self and we'll all be fine. So why are we here today? Well, the speakers that we have with us today, they're here to discuss their view of what Europe needs to do at this digital crossroad at which we find ourselves. In December 2020, so just 6 months ago, the European Commission presented its proposal for a Digital Markets Act, and it really represents an opportunity for Europe to imagine a different path than the one we're currently on. Really, the baseline aim of this proposal is to give Europe's companies a fair chance to compete and provide alternative services and business models to the internet market. But in order to do that, the speakers will discuss the objectives that DMA must fulfill to really have a meaningful impact. And I think interoperability and default settings will be two important touchstones in this conversation. So in line with the aims of the DMA, this event will also have a pretty clear business focus. We've discussed this at OFE events in the past from many different angles. And the companies represented here today in the panel are part of the European digital landscape, which is, to be frank, comprised primarily of small and medium enterprise companies and startups. And this event, I believe, comes at a very interesting time as, on the one hand, the co-legislative process is in full swing, with amendments to the original proposal being developed and negotiated in the Council and in the European Parliament. And at the same time, developments on the other side of the Atlantic indicate a potential convergence on views regarding the digital markets. Last night, Lina Khan was sworn in as chair of the Federal Trade Commission in the US. And for those who haven't followed her academic career, I believe that it's fair to say that she helped kind of usher in this broader reckoning amongst antitrust scholars and enforcers when it comes to digital platforms' role in the broader economy. And, with that said, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this afternoon's event. And with us, we have Amanda, COO and co-founder of Element and Matrix.org, Vittorio Bertola, Head of Policy and Innovation at Open Exchange, and Michael Fox, Chief Operating Officer at Proton Mail. And I think, without further ado, let's jump right in. Michael, to start this conversation off, in your view, what does, let's say, in action, perhaps a toothless digital market act, what would that lead to?
Thanks very much for the question, Astrid. So maybe by way of introduction, let me tell those who aren't familiar with Proton Technologies and our products, Proton Mail, VPN, Calendar, and Drive, what we're really about. So we are a privacy-oriented internet service provider. So essentially what that means is if you could think of other services that you might get from other technology companies, You could imagine a fully encrypted offering from Proton, essentially allowing you as individuals or businesses to have the option to keep all of your data encrypted in your control. And the idea is to continue to build out platform services that allow customers to protect their privacy using our platform. So I think your question is really interesting, Astor, because it's a good way to position the why we need to act and why we need to act with commitment. So fundamentally, if we could imagine a world in which we're even more connected than we are today. So let's use that as a starting point. If we look historically, how connected were we before the internet, even when it started becoming mainstream with even basic email 25 years ago, to the launch of the smartphone, before it became somewhat commonplace, let's call it 12 to 15 years ago. If we think of the levels of connectedness, we can only begin to imagine what that will look like in 5 or 10 or 15 years from now. Actually, it's probably beyond most people's imaginations just how interconnected that's going to be. Whether it's us as individuals, our actions between each other, supply chains, transactions, the media that we use, virtually everything will be connected. And the question then to ask is, who's going to control the options, the ideas, the principles that we're presented with? Are we comfortable with the idea that what's driving these will ultimately be non-European technology providers, carrying the principles of either the United States government's administration or the Communist Party of China's administration? I mean, just begin to think about who's going to be influencing everything that we get presented with in all facets of our lives. And I think fundamentally, if you're uncomfortable with this idea, this is why we need to begin thinking very critically at this point about what is it that we need to be doing at this point, at this juncture? What steps do we need to take to ensure that whatever that ultimately connected future looks like in just a few years is one that is essentially grounded in the principles that Europe wants to have as a society. Everyone has their own idea of what a utopia is. You might not be comfortable with big tech's concept of what utopia is, let alone in authoritarian regimes. And for those of you who might not ever have touched upon it or did touch upon it a long time ago, I would absolutely recommend a reread of George Orwell's 1984 to see what best intentions with concentrated power run amok could actually look like. So from my vantage point, the risks of how bad this could get are absolutely phenomenal. They're beyond most people's comprehension if the steps aren't taken to make sure that the principles that Europeans hold dear are ingrained in not just the legislation that governs how we do business, but are actually enforced in a way that makes it a reality. I think there's an opportunity for economic growth that won't happen in Europe if we don't take these steps. And I think ultimately Europe risks losing its technology sovereignty if we don't take not just strong policy steps, but strong policy enforcement steps. And I would conclude the sentiment with, in the 21st century, if you don't control your data, you don't control your destiny. That's how integrated everything will be. So I hope that at least answers the question and sets a little bit of a framework for the conversation we're going to have.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Michael. And then over to you, Amandine. As the CEO of a European SME, could you perhaps paint a picture of what the current challenges to compete in the internal market are? And perhaps what I'm the most interested in, what could a company like Element do with a strong DMA in place?
Sure, thanks. So again, for a bit of context, Element provides secure and decentralized communications based on the Matrix open standard. So basically, the idea of Matrix is to provide the same experience as email, but for chat and voice over IP. So as a user, I want to be able to choose the provider with who that I can trust with my data, and I want to be able to choose the app to access this data. And I want all these apps to be able to communicate with one another. So Interop is at the heart of what we're trying to do here. And Elements come, aside from the Matrix.org Foundation, the nonprofit entity, to build apps and sell services for Matrix itself. trying to grow the open ecosystem of Matrix. So in terms of, to go back to your question on the challenges as a small company in the market, well, communication ecosystem, everyone knows, is completely overtaken by a few giants. And if you're a newcomer trying to bring something new, something fresh, it's the first thing you have to do is get users on your platform, and then you can bring the value that you want to bring. So the idea that that means that the barrier to entry for you to be able to compete and provide the value is very high. This closed market completely stifles the innovation and the market opportunities. And if you look at it, basically the web is $30 trillion market. The phone network is $2 trillion market. While online comms, it's only 100 million. So that's how much between the web and online comms, and how much this big centralization is actually stifling the market. So forcing this interoperability, legalizing this interoperability would really allow smaller entities to have a go, bring something new to the users and bring some new business models. And the competition will happen at merit level. It's the value that one brings which makes it drives the market up, as opposed to the size of the network of users that they have. And it would keep the incumbents completely honest and completely open up this market. In terms of what a strong DMA would allow here, so as I was saying, basically it will lower the barrier to entry for user acquisition. It gives small companies a bigger market to play with. It brings faster innovation, competition, driving up the value for both customers and users. So the other thing that was mentioned earlier is that it's not all about legalization and regulations, etc. It also needs to be easy to apply, because these small companies don't have the legal means to go through filing up a lot of paper or going through certifications like ISO style certifications, which cost way too much. And badly applied, badly created, this regulation would completely cancel the benefit of what it's trying to bring. And it would also needs to be enforced properly, because again, the small companies don't have the power to actually sue the giants because they're not enforcing things properly. So it's a balance between it's really about making sure that the regulations which we are putting out there are easily applied by everyone and also properly enforced, so that the big giants have to comply too.
Yeah, and I think thanks for that. And I think both standards and the question of DMA enforcement, we'll have reason to come back to that in a few minutes. But Vittorio, on the point of interoperability, perhaps you could give us a quick explainer of what we mean with platform interoperability, what it is, and how does it work, and why do you think it's important for in the DMA?
Well, first of all, OpenExchange is a European open source maker in the email and DNS fields. So we make applications that are used by big telcos, by small ISPs, by individuals. We serve more than 200 million people, and this is only possible because this is based on open interoperable standards that exist for email and for the DNS. So interoperability is actually the ability of applications and services by multiple makers to work with each other. So it's as simple as that. I mean, it's in vertical terms, so-called vertical terms. This means that my email app can work with any email provider. So I can use the same email application for with any email service. But in horizontal terms, so the ones that are more interesting for the competition, this means that, for example, my email service can send an email to your email service, even if they are competitors. So you have competing service providers that still can work together to offer you a service. And this is really peculiar of the internet. It's actually one of the founding principles of the internet since the origins. And this is actually what enabled the internet to grow, to bring innovation, to bring choice and competition. The initial, let's say, internet services like email and web are all based on interoperability and of both types. So with email, with the web, you can use any web browser to access any website, and in most cases, at least, it will work. This started to change in recent times. So we have to get back to the original principles of the internet, because otherwise we will be losing all the possibilities that the internet has been opening for decades now. And that we've seen them go away in the last decade or so with the growth of these very big dominant platforms.
Yeah, and with that, I think also the historical perspective and some examples is something we'll get back to of how interoperability obligations have worked in the past. But just to get one quick follow-up question, Vittorio, just to make it quite specific from your point of view with the Digital Markets Act proposal from the Commission, what is it that you guys at Open Exchange would like to see changed?
Well, we've seen that provision that is in the current draft, and we think it's really, really limited. It is just for auxiliary services, which are important, like payment or identification. These are really services that need some opening. So it is really welcome, but we should not limit ourselves at that. We actually need the principle to be brought forward for all the internet services, all the core platform services, to the entire list of services that are covered by the DMA. And this also needs to be provided not just to business users, but to all users. This is also because in some of these services, it's not that easy to distinguish the business users from the end users in general. I mean, that's easy maybe for online intermediation platforms like, not my names, Amazon. In that kind of service, you have really a separate two-sided market with, business users from one side and end users from the other. But if you take instant messaging or social media, these are platform services that connect people together. In instant messaging, you just know maybe a mobile phone number or a username. You don't really know whether that's a business, that's a person. So it's really hard also in practical terms to tell whether this is a business service or a personal service. So actually just also to count the users in terms of business users and not. So we think the provision is good, but really needs to be extended and increased to cover all types of users and to cover all types of platform services.
Yeah, thanks. But okay, so we're talking about interoperability here. We'll also discuss default standards in a little, or default settings in a little bit. But interoperability as a rule works through standards, is at the core of many interoperability efforts. So I'm thinking, Ahmadine, complying to common standards across, let's say, an industry. What about innovation in this context? This has definitely been something that is, concerns around this have been raised in the Brussels bubble.
Innovation wins. Basically, the standard you define gives you the baseline. It's the lowest common denominator. It defines how the data transit. But then, everything is open on how you present this data, how the user interact with the data, what it is used for in the end. So if you take messaging, for example, it can be used for individual messaging. Is it collaboration? Is it collaboration for a specific type of team? Is it customer service? And it's endless, but yet it's still messaging. And the innovation can happen at so many levels. There is this value add level, the service, the experience you provide the users. Then you have the technical level. How do you most efficiently deliver this said data? For example, for Matrix, the standard is defined. We have 6 different servers implementation, and all in different languages. Some of them are more scalable than others. Some scale horizontally, some are faster, some are lighter. Then you have hundreds of different clients, because people will write down the clients which fits the specific use case, their own subjective taste. And it's really about the standard itself is just the core of it. And there are many different levels where then you can add the variety and the value add. And the business model, can you still see me? I see seems to be
the video disappeared. We will hear you well.
Okay, so if you hear me, that's fine. And then the other innovation can happen at the business level, business model level as well, because you have a standard, but then you can sell hosting. Do you want to sell on-premise support? Do you want to sell value-add services on top of the standard itself? Or do I rely on someone else for the hosting, etc.? So yeah, standard is far from limiting. On the contrary, it just brings diversity and variety and opens up to so many different opportunities out there.
No, that's very interesting because so I'm turning now to Michael, but I think that most of you will have a little bit of something to add to this question. We've been talking about how important the DMA is, and it is this junction and this opportunity for Europe. But another concern that we've definitely heard among policymakers is if we have more interoperability and more companies active in this space processing personal data, what about privacy? What about encryption? Aren't these things that are at risk with increased interoperability?
So no, there's a I'll call it a false belief, a false premise out there that in order to have interoperability, you can't have encryption. That's actually not the case. So as long as there are standards of what's being, how things are being encrypted, and encrypted communications have standards, there are standard encryption protocols. So being able to have this interoperability, this interchange of encrypted data, this is absolutely possible. So just to put that topic to bed, that's a complete misnomer, misunderstanding of what encryption is and how interoperability works. I'll say one additional comment on interoperability. I think Amandine and Vittorio have framed this up really well. The point I want to add to that is interoperability is about making things work together practically, right? So in the sense that you can have regulations about things being interoperable and create standards and create rules around that. But it's very easy for a large technology company to create technical barriers or operational barriers or commercial barriers to actually implementing it. And this is a core strategy of large technology companies. So in name, they will create things that are theoretically interoperable, but practically, either from a cost basis or all the steps that you would have to go through either as a user or a service provider, make it completely impractical to implement. So these interoperable services from smaller European companies will never happen. So regulators think they've passed laws and they think they've solved the problem, but in reality, they've left so much of the detail untouched that it leaves a tremendous amount of room for large tech companies to fudge in that space and make it essentially completely impractical. So it never really happens. That's one, and maybe I'll give an example or talk about defaults in this context as well. Consumers need to have a choice in a very practical sense, right? So again, not theoretical. How can I practically choose to use A, B, C, or D as an option? And a lot of the conversation is, well, if we look at the DMA, we say, okay, we won't have defaults. Okay, that's great, but you need to have a very practical implementation standard of what does that mean not to have defaults. For example, to be able to have choice, and Google today just came out, the head of Google's European competition group said today that they're in favor of having choice screens when customers start a device. I know there's been some debate about do customers want choice screens or not. And the reality is we go through choice screens all the time, especially since GDPR. You might have noticed that every single time you go to a website, you're being asked to make choices about the data retention, right? Every single time. So when we talk about choice screens, when somebody procures a new device, a laptop or a mobile phone, putting choice screens in front of them is nothing that doesn't happen every single day. And this is a one-time event. And by doing this, we have the chance to introduce alternative services to customers who might not otherwise think about it. They might not realize they have a choice. They might already buy a device thinking they're locked into an ecosystem, when in fact, they don't have to be. And if that's the intention of regulations, then you have to make it practical. So the whole concept of choice screens is making a regulation practical, making interoperability practical. I think there's one other point to make in terms of interoperability. The data itself, right? How do we make data interoperable? So if you want to migrate from one service to another, email, or you want to interconnect messaging services, whatever that is, there has to be very practical, easy to implement standards that need to be enforced of how these things happen. because there's no way you can hop through a million different technical hurdles to make messaging compatible if the technology companies want to create so many operational blocks to making the actual data to set these up incompatible or inoperable. I know that I got a little bit away from your question, Aster, in terms of economic impact and such. I'm happy to go back there if you'd like me to.
No, but this stirs up some questions of my own, and I think that is a good segue, because it's one thing, obviously, to discuss these conversations in the situation that we find ourselves right now. But I think it could be interesting, Vittorio, I'm looking at you here, to maybe give us a little bit of a historic perspective. The idea of interoperability as a kind of pro-competition tool is not necessarily a new one. And maybe you can explain a little bit in those terms, and, since I know you've been involved in conversations around internet governance for a very long time, how incumbents play around with interoperability to protect their market position, etc.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying, there was a general recognition, let's say 20 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, that interoperability was the cornerstone of the internet. And this has been increasingly eroded. If you look at the new services that were introduced in the first decade of this millennium, let's say, they were often interoperable, even the one by the big platforms. I mean, the first chat service by Google was built on the open XMPP standard, for example, and it was perfectly interoperable with others. And then as they grew the user base, at a certain point in time, they decided not to make it interoperable anymore. In other cases, these services use open standards, but then refuse to interoperate. So even if you know the language, the standard is the language you need to use to talk with the service, you're not allowed to do that. Well, they will reject your attempts to connect with a different client or application. Or there are, artificial barriers that are more and more imposed in the name of security or control or whatever. I mean, if you are a small ISP in Europe, you know that it's increasingly hard to deliver email from your users to Gmail, because they have a very strong AI-powered anti-spam, anti-abuse filters that somehow, at a certain point in time, may decide that all the email from your ISP is possibly abusive, and just stop accepting it. And you are not, your users will not be able anymore to communicate with Gmail users. And this is destroying your business, basically, if you're an email provider. But still, it's very hard to get listened to, because if you're a very small company in Poland or in Portugal, and on the other side, you have a huge platform, which, is just doing everything by AI and doesn't have a business interest to talk to you. So, in the end, there are many reasons that can be claimed, as a good excuse, let's say, not to interoperate. But in the end, there is a final business reason, which is, by refusing to interoperate, you prevent your users from choosing. You stifle competition, you lock your users down so that they cannot pick a different service. Or if they can, because they can in the end, it will be so hard that they will not be doing it in big numbers in practice. So, as a user, I think we all have the experience of using instant messaging applications today. That's the easiest example I can make. If you want to try a new instant messaging application, you have to install a new one, but you still need to keep all the others. And I think most of us already have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different instant messaging and chat applications, and you need each of them to discuss with different people, and sometimes more people are on more than one of them, and you don't remember where you were talking to that person specifically on that argument at that time, and you have to look for the conversation. So this is becoming a nightmare. Just think of how many resources are wasted on this. If I need to have like 6 applications rather than just having one, I need to consume 6 more times energy and resources on my device. Maybe my device becomes obsolete sooner than it could be, and I will have to buy a new one. And so this is generating also an environmental impact. And this is really inconvenient for everyone except for the dominant platforms. And even if I do make the effort as a user to try a new application, then no one is there because all the users are still using the other ones. So, even if I would have to convince all my friends, contacts, or followers on social media to move to the new platform just to be able to continue following me. And nobody can do that. And so, unless you really have a very, very, very good reason, you're really motivated, like some niche markets are, but otherwise you will not stop using the dominant platform. And this is preventing innovation and competition. I know your experience. To make a last example, I use Facebook every day, and I have a old computer. It's a 5-year-old MacBook, so it's not that old. In the end, it was also not a cheap computer. But then in my browser, if I start to use today's Facebook interface, it's very hard. I mean, it just destroys my computer. My computer is dying under the weight of the client. And I cannot choose a different one. So if I could, I would possibly use a different social media client, which could interoperate. So use an application made by someone else, which is better for me. Maybe it's more respectful of my privacy. Maybe it's just more efficient in terms of computation. And I would use a different application to connect with all my Facebook followers. But I cannot do that because that's a closed system and it does not interoperate. So this is what we need to get to. We need to get to a situation in which other people in Europe and everywhere in the world can build alternative clients for the dominant platforms, which, if they are better, that they will have a chance to succeed. And this will be better for everyone and also for competition.
And I think I'm thinking, building on that, Amandine, glad to see you back, by the way. I mean, from our experience at OFE, we've obviously worked kind of on the policy side of interoperability and open standards now for almost 20 years. And it's quite recurrent that we hear the argument from, let's say, the incumbent digital companies that it's very technically difficult to interoperate, and that links to what we talked about earlier around security and privacy are arguments to put forward. And just to get back to that, because it would be interesting to pick your brain also on this part and hear your thoughts on this and these arguments that are being put forward against interoperability.
So the way I see it is that first you have two different cases. If you go for a case where you're just trying to bridge existing platform by providing some very simple way for them to talk to one another, and then the second case is that all these platforms natively actually embrace an open standard completely natively. So in the first case, where you're just trying to match people together, then the user needs to be aware that they're talking to a different platform. And in that case, this new service, this other service, like let's say I'm on Teams, I'm talking to someone who may be on Slack, then I need to be aware I'm talking to this person on Slack, and that Slack may have different terms and conditions. So it's basically a choice from the user to jump the step and actually say, hey, I'm taking this risk. And until the day where all the services who are actually encrypted, which are not most of them, if the services are encrypted, if they're not using the same encryption, yes, you have to break the encryption to build the bridge between the two of them. So by using a kind of bridging mechanism as a first step towards interop, it does make it slightly less, a bit more complicated to manage privacy because the user had to be aware of it and make a choice. Encryption, aside from people like Signal, well, not many services use encryption anyway, so that's probably fine. If you get to the point where the services actually natively embrace an open standard, then encryption should be part of this open standard, which means that whatever the service you use, then it will be end-to-end encrypted from one side to the other, and you don't have to worry about it. It's part of it. It's completely compatible. We do it today with 33 million users on Matrix. It works. In terms of the privacy side of things, then yes, you may be registered on one service provider and you may be talking to someone on another service provider. The same way, I think, Michael, I think you were the one talking, or Vittorio, about email providers wanting to talk to Gmail, which may be blocked. Different terms and conditions, but yet it works. But as a user, I need to be aware that every email I send to Gmail, it's going to be treated by Google somehow. And it's going to be the same case here. Like if you use this open standard to communicate between two services, I need to be aware these other services may have different terms and conditions. But that's table stake. I'm accessing the web. Every time I touch a server, they have different terms and conditions. I'm sending an email to someone else. Every time I do it, they have different terms and conditions. I'm using an interoperable standard. I'm using an open standard to chat between different services. They may have different terms and conditions. However, what the actual open standards bring is that you may be still using the same provider as people you want to talk to. So you are aligned, you're all using you all signed up to the same terms and condition. However, you may do it with a different app, and you may have a different user experience. So that's basically the difference between let's provide some first level interop where people can bridge between the different platforms, and the next step, which is let's all align on the proper open standard, and let's all align on the proper encryption standard, where users can actually get the choice and have their make it easier for them to manage their privacy right without compromising on the choice and the user experience itself. So basically, interoperability brings freedom and choice. But the same way, you have to find a balance between privacy at all costs and usability, because people who are using WhatsApp, for example, which is super easy to use, people who don't really care about what's happening with their data, and people who are have very strong ideas on what is happening to their data, they usually don't have the same level of acceptance of usability friction. Do I have to remember 3 passwords? A lot of people are saying, no, I don't want to set a PIN code and a passphrase and whatever on this. If you care about your privacy a lot, you will be happy to do so. So it's a balance to find between privacy and usability. And the same way here, basically there will be a balance to find between privacy at all cost and interoperability. But I'm sure we can, basically that's what we're trying to do again with Matrix. There is a middle ground, which is good enough, where people can have control over their data. They have the choice on where to get it hosted without completely compromising on their privacy. There is a good enough middle ground. And if people want to go for full privacy at all costs, they can do that too.
Yeah, and I guess the status quo currently when it comes to data handling and processing is not really optimal from any privacy concerned citizens' view anyhow. I'm thinking now to bring it back, we've touched on standards, innovation, and both kind of business and technical parts. To bring it back a little bit to kind of the broader tech agenda, I'm wondering, Michael, you touched on it in the first question a little bit, and I wonder if you could develop this a little bit further. Where do you see the DMA with the things we're discussing here, interoperability, but perhaps also default settings? How do you see that this fits into kind of the wider digital policy agenda? And I'm thinking here specifically on the kind of tech sovereignty question. What's the link here?
Yeah, it's a good question, Esther. So when I think about the Digital Markets Act, it's really about Europe's technology opportunity. And within the technology opportunity, I would say there's certainly technology sovereignty. There's the foundation of European principles, and there's the economic growth opportunity. So maybe we go through some of these. So in terms of technical sovereignty, I guess it becomes a question of whether or not Europe wants to become less dependent on Chinese and US technology, because these are the dominant platforms and the power just keeps concentrating. So when you think about this, and the comment I made earlier, that if you don't control your data in the 21st century, you don't control your destiny. This is very real. So I think when it comes to technical sovereignty, it's not just that, okay, if I'm a European parliamentarian, or I'm just a European citizen, I'm thinking, well, who really controls the future of what life in Europe looks like? When everything's connected on these platforms, and everything that's presented to us, how things are done, what's done, the ideas that are presented to us, everything, just absolutely every control point in our lives. When this is controlled by technology platforms that are not based in Europe, the data doesn't sit in Europe anymore. Again, it's how strong the enforcement is, because the efforts you see by big data is, yes, we keep some things here, we have to process on other sides. This is the argument by big technology companies. At the end of the day, if there's not a platform or platforms in Europe that offer true technology sovereignty, at some point Europe does lose control of its destiny. There's just no other way it could be. So I think that's important. Protecting data in the EU doesn't just mean you have to store it here, but all the processing has to happen here. But then again, how this happens and who's making the decisions and what's put in front of us. Do we want European companies to be driving this, or do we want Chinese and American companies to be driving this? This is a legitimate question. The second part, I guess that ties closer to European principles. So in Europe, we value the right to privacy, and we value the right to data protection, right? So individuals own their data conceptually in Europe. I mean, that's the goal of the rights we have, is that Europeans stay in control of that. In the Americas, the bias is very much towards businesses own your data. And of course, as we pivot towards Asia, it's very much the government owns your data. And I think without Europe being in there with a strong position that, no, actually citizens really own their own data and need to control it, and it needs to be here and needs to be operated upon on platforms that are European in nature and principled in European values. In the absence of that, you could only expect that the principles of Europe will be eroded in the digital age, and that there will not be technical sovereignty. And then the last point is, you could expect that there won't be economic opportunity around that either. So the positive side of that is, if we create the DMA with all of the teeth needed and it's enforced appropriately, and we could talk about enforcement as a follow-up to this, what really happens? We accelerate high-value job creation in the technology sector. So not just small companies that have moderate wages, but actually companies that have all scales of wages producing technology services and operating them within Europe, creating lots of value, so high income. So you have all of that potential income tax, you have all the derivative value-added tax that come off the increased spending, and then you have companies headquartered in Europe, so you could think of increasing the corporate tax base substantially. I think it's no surprise to any European parliamentarian that there is a serious tax issue, which is slowly being addressed with some recent announcements. But at the end of the day, no technology companies are incentivized in any way other than duress to pay tax in Europe. So wouldn't it be great if we had big technology companies that were actually headquartered here? So just think about the economic impact of governments having larger tax bases, people having higher incomes and higher, better paying jobs, and not just low-level service jobs in technology, and not just small companies trying to build some technology to sort of get a little bit of market share, but actually building things of substance and of magnitude. So I think ultimately, if we think about the European technology opportunity in the context of economic growth opportunity, if we think of it in the context of technical sovereignty and European principles, you come away thinking, why wouldn't we make this, the DMA, as comprehensive as possible in terms of things that companies shouldn't be permitted to do, but very prescriptive in how they do it in a way that really does level the playing field and create opportunity for European businesses and Europe as a whole to have its own sovereignty going forward. So I'll stop there on that.
Yeah, no, that's great. So, so we've gone through this now, and obviously, with this being, let's say, a panel of quite a lot of agreement, let me pose a slightly trickier question to Vittorio, perhaps. Then, why do you think that we didn't see more in the Commission proposal? If we consider, if I remember correctly, I think it was in September we saw a leak from earlier draft versions of the planned DMA, where, for example, interoperability obligations were more comprehensive. And now, latest in MEP Schwab's report, nothing really of substance on interoperability either. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, this is a question for the Commission and for MEP Schwab and for the people that wrote those reports. But I'm really actually happy to see so many other sources that are recommending this. I mean, in the end, there are institutional sources like EDPB, or there have been reports by the competition authorities of several major countries, France, Germany, or national regulators by these countries, or the UK, the expert studies like the UK Furman report, consumer groups like BIOC, industry associations like ECO. So this is really a broad request. It's not something coming from a small group of people that have some kind of very high-level abstract vision. It's actually coming from all sides of the European community, and more importantly, as we are showing here today, this is coming from the European internet industry. I mean, the three companies here were part of a group of 40 companies that sent a letter to all the involved MEPs just a few months ago. And I was the one coordinating the letter. And in like 2 weeks, we got 40 companies from 10 different countries that were rushing to sign this, because this is really something that the people that are striving to create, actually, an European internet industry that is successful and are already successful, but see the opportunities to do more. This is really something that they ask. And I think that after all these words that we've been hearing for years now about the importance of growing European internet companies and creating, digital sovereignty or digital autonomy, however you want to call it, then, as people that are actually striving to do this, we should be supported by the regulation. So we're really asking the Parliament to do something more, to dare. I think this is the time to dare if we want to have an impact. And like the GDPR has shown, I think that the European Union can have an impact on the internet exactly through this angle. Maybe we will never be the land of 1 million startups. I hope we will become that one, but maybe that will never happen. But we can change the rules of the internet, and the GDPR has shown that we can have an effort. So this is the time to do something similar that is far-reaching, can have an impact for decades, and can change the shape of the markets of the internet. We just need the European Parliament to be courageous and to do this.
Could I add on to Vittorio's comment? Because first of all, I couldn't agree more about GDPR. It's the gold standard in the world. I've had conversations in South America with companies and governments doing policy making, and they use GDPR as the standard to which they aspire. And for me, that there couldn't be anything better than using GDPR as their benchmark. So I couldn't be happier about it. The point that you're making around interoperability and why did some of these rules in the earlier drafts disappear. I'll give you my 2 cents on that. I think there's been a lot of pressure by big tech going around and lobbying about how difficult it is actually to create interoperability from a technical standpoint, how it would require a lot of investment. It's much more complicated than people think. And this is the storyline they go and they tell everybody. So just in context, I spent 12 years inside a very large technology company, Microsoft. I'm familiar with not just theirs, but the industry, so the large tech arguments around this space. There's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt intentionally created on these issues. Just think for a moment, these are companies that have mapped the entire earth and can zoom into the street level and look through your window. They create artificial intelligence powered robots and vehicles that can drive themselves. The limits to their technology innovation is far beyond what most people even realize. When they say, oh, it's too difficult to create interoperability, this is complete nonsense. This is a small problem. I'm not saying it's a zero problem, but it's a small problem compared to the problems they tackle every day. So if somebody listening on this call, if you are a parliamentarian who's hearing from big tech and hearing how difficult this is, I can assure you this is a low-level problem for them. It's complete fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That's it. It's nothing more.
Yeah, basically the problem is absolutely not technical. The problem is political. Is how do you get everyone to agree so that to one single standard where all the company can talk to one another? That's the only problem they have to solve. So yes, I agree. For having built an open standard and made it as easy to use as possible, we can definitely say it's not difficult, especially if you use stuff which are out there, and if you rely on entities which are not bound to any commercial entities, like foundations, like ours, for example, or any other. The idea is very much to not let this be driven by only big corp, and make sure that there are some independent entities out there so that we get to a clear conclusion. But yes, technically, it's not impossible. It's not hard.
Okay, that's great. I'm looking now, we have around 10 more minutes to go. And there's one last question that I want to ask you all. And so like we already hinted at it a little bit, it will be on enforcement. We're getting some good questions in from the chat. And I want to save a little bit of time to make sure that we can get to those as well. But I'm thinking I'll put it out to all three of you and we'll see who jumps on it. But just the question of important, there's this, or of enforcement. There's this discussion right now between, or on the one hand, you have the ex-ante approach that is, strongly promoted in some of the articles and very much in place the framework for that in the DMA proposal. And then there's the argument from the other side around treating this case by case. How do you see this? Now we get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of the DMA, but any thoughts on this?
I'm happy to offer a first thought. I think it needs to be ex ante. Ex post is too expensive and too slow, right? Things are changing incredibly fast. We can't wait for there to be an abuse of competition law, for then things to run for years before there's actually enough evidence and to substantiate a prosecution that will then drag on for years, that will ultimately, result in a decision that might change something in new legislation a couple more years after that, right? Everything is moving way too quickly. And to be honest, the technology companies are playing this competition game, the big ones, every single day, and they're taking advantage of the game every single day. So the ex ante approach, essentially what it does is it becomes more proactive, right? So what this is, these are small challenges on a regular basis at the EU level, at the national level, and these are proactive. And what they're essentially doing, they're keeping big tech on the back foot. It's essentially saying, don't do anything that will violate, because we're going to be on you the minute you do it, right? And I think this is important, because if they know they can get away with it for a few years before they get slapped on the wrist, they're going to do it. So in terms of enforcement, my strong recommendation is good coordination between the EU and the nation states, and say, look, how are we going to deal with these issues very aggressively upfront in sort of a micro issue way, and really monitor this and take actions as things are happening, and send constant warnings out to the large tech platform operators that these are behaviors that are not acceptable in Europe, and you won't get out of the starting blocks if you try. For me, that's enforcement of policy that is real time, which is how fast technology and the internet is moving.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we just need to set clear principles and rules in advance, and then enforce them timely. I don't care if it's on a national level, a European level, a mix. I mean, that's not my territory, but anything that actually works and can produce results quickly. The only thing I wanted to add is that then there is the need to, for any specific service, to come to practical decisions on standards and policies, and then at the technical level. This is true. And for that discussion, please make sure that you involve the entire industry and the entire internet community, not just the gatekeeper and the regulator, because there are some technicalities that do need to be addressed. And there is a wealth of companies and also people not necessarily, let's say, working for profit entities, even just in the community, that would be happy to contribute to standards making in the internet way, and would be happy to provide ideas on how to make this work in practice. So let's all work together, the different stakeholders together, so that we find effective solutions.
Yeah, and maybe more experience into working on this kind of questions than big corporate company to the other players. So I agree.
Okay. So for the last 7 minutes, let's jump to some of the questions in the chat. I think that there are some good ones that we haven't touched on, and I think this is the first one here from Tib will be an important one to just also explain. I'm first thinking of Vittorio here, just because I know you're quite engaged with the DMA day to day. But he's asking the question: is there a way that the DMA could backfire against SMEs? And he's here with the argument, in his view, that in the same way that the GDPR sometimes has a bigger impact on small companies than on large established ones with larger legal teams. I guess it's a question of about the scope of the DMA here and the obligations.
Yeah, and then the easy answer is no. I mean, because differently from the GDPR, the DMA obligations only apply to gatekeepers, so to companies that are already in a dominant position and they've already tipped the market and conquered it and locked it down in some way. So, I mean, we can discuss on where to set the threshold, but definitely SMEs will not be affected by the provisions of the DMA. So this is also a part of the FAD maybe that is being discussed. Actually, I think this is going to be very positive for the SMEs, because, by the way, the European internet industry is disproportionately made out of SMEs in comparison to the US, to China, and so on. So we actually need to do something that defends the small players, like the companies here, like most of the European internet industry, from the dominant platforms. And that will actually be helpful for the SMEs.
Yeah, I think that's it is important to look at the DMA, that it's very different to the GDPR and, for example, the DSA, so the other big platform package also here, where the scope is definitely more narrow. So to the next question, let's see. So for the ones watching, I might miss one, but we'll try to get to them. James Riley is asking, wouldn't the EU become less appealing to multinational companies? They're already moving to less regulated markets.
So I'm happy to take that or start there. So the answer is absolutely not. This is the richest market in the world. They will absolutely be here. First of all, a lot of their employees are here, working and creating wealth for their investors. They're not going to leave the market. They're not going to, from a talent perspective, from a market opportunity perspective. No, so it's if you look inside the strategy groups of any large tech company, it doesn't matter what's going to happen, tax-wise, regulation-wise, they're never leaving Europe. It's not going to happen. It would be too much of a financial loss to them, too much of a talent loss to them, too much of an opportunity loss. It would never happen.
Also, as Michael was saying earlier, basically it's the kind of regulation which is paving the way. We're saying the pendulum going back into more privacy control, and GDPR is leading, and DMA would be leading too. So if it may scare a bit some smaller companies who can afford to stay out of Europe, then it's just delaying the problem, and it will get across the world later at some point anyway.
Okay, and here I think this is a good question to end on, because it's quite forward-looking, and then we'll see. We might have some time also for some final statements. But so from Asbjørn, what are the key challenges in achieving a strong DMA? That is a broad question. But what are the battlefields going to be like in the next few months, and what are the key points to watch out for? He's asking this from the perspective of how an EU citizen could help in this process. Also, I'm just throwing this out there to anyone who wants to pick it up.
I think Vittorio's point earlier in terms of battling and debunking the FUD is a good one. So the big corp are jumping on this and trying to create problems where there are not any. It's not going to be easy to get to a good DMA, and it's when you involve in the entire industry, it's always hard to get everyone on the same page. But let's not give the bigger player a stronger voice than what they deserve, basically, because they can really drive things in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I think that the points of contention that are already emerging are like, well, of course, the gatekeeper thresholds, but mostly the list of provisions in the Articles 5 and 6. So, I mean, what will actually the gatekeepers be required to do, and also the enforcement part, because there might be attempts to make the DMA a blunt instrument by making enforcement impossible or so. And actually, this has been partly the problem with the GDPR as well. We've seen so many provisions, and it's been very hard to enforce them throughout the internet. And there have been cases, for example, of country shopping with some of the big companies, global companies, going to specific countries, and it's been hard to enforce stuff there. So I think I'd recommend to lawmakers to take care and make good use of the examples we got from the GDPR to make sure that the enforcement architecture is positive. And in general, as citizens, I think you just have to explain what's happening and do something if you can with your MEPs and with your political parties, and explain what's happening and try to push things in the right direction.
And from my side, I would simply add that what will continue to be debated, and what's absolutely critical to the effectiveness of the DMA is what are the implementation requirements to achieve what's set out in the DMA, because there's a lot of wiggle room, there's a lot of grayness around this. And I would not underestimate by any means the capabilities of technology companies, the large technology platform companies, the gatekeepers as we call them here, to innovate in terms of creating competitive obstacles, both commercial, technical. They will do everything possible. Every gap of light you leave in the DMA, expect them to exploit it. Expect them. That's how they work. So I would say make it as comprehensive and as airtight as possible. Leave as little gaps as possible. Be as prescriptive as you can be on the implementation side. what is required to actually make this a pragmatic recommendation for every one of the recommendations. Right.
Okay, perfect. So we're on top of the hour, or at the top of the hour. So maybe just as a last little, partially call to action, or just like the one last sentence that you would like the participants, or rather the audience, to bring with them for today. Maybe just a quick round. Amandine, do you want to start?
Sure. I think the important point is that Interop is far from stifling anything, reducing privacy, reducing innovation. Far from it. It's basically what is going to allow us as citizens and us as companies, European companies and any companies really, to actually be able to go further. It's going to bring more choice to the user, more market for the companies, and it's just a matter of opening up everything and bringing back the control of everyone's data into their own hands, as opposed to giving it to very big players. It's not going to be an easy implementation, but it needs to be easy to implement for companies and quickly enforceable as well.
Okay, perfect. Vittorio?
Well, I'd say that all telecommunications systems in history started with a lot of innovation and competition, and then soon we saw consolidation and became something which was not creating so much innovation and competition anymore. And we have to prevent the internet from going the same direction, and we've been seeing that happen in the last decades or so, at least. So the interoperability was really the cornerstone principle over which the internet was originally built. If we are able to preserve it by regulation, because there's no other way to do that, then I think we will be successful to maybe still having the internet as a free, open medium that can bring opportunities, economic, social, cultural opportunities everywhere in Europe and in the world for several decades, let's say.
And Michael, final words.
Yeah, I would say I would encourage Europeans and the politicians of Europe to be very courageous right now. The game is on, and the stakes are extraordinarily high. Don't underestimate the competition here. It's moving much faster than you think. It's more powerful than you think, and the stakes really couldn't be higher for the future of Europe. So be bold, be courageous, because now's the time to do it.
Well, great point to end on. Michael, Vittoria, Amandine, thank you very much for joining this event today. It was a good, tight, very informational hour. I hope to chat with you a bunch more, because I don't think the DMA saga will be over in just a few months. It will probably go on for quite a while. But thank you very much for participating in today's event, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.